A few weeks ago, I decided I would try to create a build using the new Warden Ascendancy in Path of Exile. I really wanted to create a build that utilized the new Avatar of the Wilds node that a lot of people seem to dismiss due to it being a conditional buff that wasn't up all the time. This node gives a buff that has 80% more elemental damage when it's active, and in order to activate the buff, you need to gain 100 stacks of the Unbound Fury, which comes from elemental ailment procs from hits on enemies. It certainly doesn't feel good to have a build revolved around a damage buff that is only up for 10 seconds at a time, but this led me to theorize what skills I could use to solve this issue and proc enough elemental ailments in order to have an easier time upkeeping this massive elemental damage buff. Last league, I tried to create a cast on crit build using the new Elemental Hit Transfigure gem to proc casts of Tornado of Elemental Turbulence Transfigure gem. It definitely did not work out the way I wanted it to because I had no idea how to scale the damage enough. However, I recently watched a video about Mathel's self-cast Tornado of Elemental Turbulence Elementalist build, and this inspired an idea for me. My thoughts were that since the tornadoes from this ability proc damage every 0.25 seconds, if I made them 100% crit, then they would always proc an elemental ailment every 0.25 seconds. This means I could generate enough elemental ailments to stack the hell out of the Unbound Fury for the Avatar of the Wilds buff, and have it up when I need it pretty much all the time. In my opinion, this spell perfectly synergizes with Warden's Ascendancy for this reason, and especially with the new Oath of Spring node, because we can now stack shocks, and it seems to be that every 2% stacking proc of shock gives a stack of Unbound Fury, which helps us even more when we get a lightning tornado to spawn from our ability. Sometimes I find myself proccing the Avatar buff multiple times in long boss fights, but usually the 80% more elemental damage buff is enough to absolutely annihilate bosses within the 10-second window. I'm kind of surprised that people were so negative and critical of this conditional buff because 10 seconds with that much burst of multiplicative damage is more than enough to melt map bosses. Now, I totally understand for pinnacle boss fights and and other endgame content, this may not always be the case, but with this build, I'm hoping that I can try to solve that issue. Now then, how does this all work? Well, let's take a deeper look at how I'm putting all this together. Like I said before, I'm basing this build off of a Mathel build that he did at the end of last league, I believe, except we aren't following it exactly. I'm mostly just working off of his ideas. As he was using an elementalist, we're now using something brand new in the game. I liked how he was using triple Herald buffs to gain a bunch of flat elemental and physical damage to spells, which increases Tornado's damage a lot, as the way the ability works is, when we spawn a tornado with the spell, it converts 100% of that physical damage to a different elemental damage type. As such, we're using Herald of Purity, Herald of Ash, and Herald of Ice, but Herald of Thunder isn't necessary for the build as it provides less added elemental damage than the rest. Herald of Ash in particular is really strong because it's overkill damage procs, which helps a lot with clear. Not that we need any more clear because of how effective these massive fast moving tornadoes are. I am using Herald of Thunder myself currently because I don't have another reservation skill I really care to use right now, and I have enough reservation efficiency to have it up, even if it's just for a small buff. Now, you may be looking at my buffs and my reserved life and mana and thinking, how the hell are you keeping all these buffs active? Well, I'm using a combination of gear that I really enjoy, which also allows us to utilize the 30% more spell damage buff from Pain Attunement, where we need to be in low life. So I use Prism Guardian to reserve life instead of mana for any socrative skills, and have increased reservation efficiency for those skills. This allows me to run Zealotry, Grace, and Discipline as auras in order to keep low life and gain massive bonuses to damage and survivability. With having such little life, we need to do one of two things in order to deal with chaos damage. We could either use an Ivory Tower setup with a Course Gating Flask, as I had done when I played Ball Lightning Orbiting Archmage Hierophant last league, and Mana Bond Hierophant as well. Or we could go super old school using a Shavron's Wrappings and stack a lot of Chaos Res. For the sake of budget, I decided to use Shavs as I found it super cheap to get a 5 link of it. So now Chaos damage does not bypass Energy Shield, and we aren't limited to 1 HP like we would be with Chaos Inoculation, which wouldn't let me reserve any life. With this setup, all I need to do is stack a lot of energy shield and chaos resistance. I currently am struggling stacking enough energy shield, uh, as I only have about 3.5 thousand. But this build was more of a proof of concept at this stage anyways, and I can scale that in the future with better gear. Obviously with this, we don't have enough life for all of our Herald skills, but we do have enough reservation efficiency to reserve them with mana and still have over half of our mana left for casting as well as for being able to utilize Mind Over Matter as another defensive layer. Next, I'm using Mathel's idea for a power charge stacking build using Void Battery Wand in order to gain a lot of crit chance and spell damage for our spell. With this wand, we want to go into the tree here and take the power charge nodes. If I had more currency, I would be investing in a Timeless Jewel in order to get the keystone node that gives spell damage for each power charge. I'm using a Crown of the Inward Eye currently, as it lets me stack a bunch of energy shield and mana, which in turn leads to increases in damage based on those. I also managed to find a replica Dragon Fang Flight's amulet with +3 to tornado gems for only 1 divine, which is nice for damage instead of having to use the unique helmet that Mathel used for +6 to the skill, but you couldn't use support gems. This way, I could still use a 6-link setup with ideally Tornado Tornado of Elemental Turbulence plus crit damage support, Inspiration, Power Charge on crit, critical strikes, and an Empower gem. I also tested using Unleash and Spell Echo and found that the playstyle was a little weird for each, so I prefer to just normal cast a spell. You could use faster casting if needed, but I find I have enough cast speed with the wand. Unleash actually gives a ton of burst DPS, especially shown in the POB. Problem is that when we use Unleash to cast Tornado, each tornado is the same element instead of one of each different tornadoes. So instead we get like 3 fire tornadoes or 3 cold tornadoes or 3 lightning tornadoes each time we cast with the full Unleash buff. This makes it a lot harder to proc the elements really quickly, as we don't gain stacks of Unbound Fury if the mob is hit with the same type of damage, unless it's lightning. As such, it's much faster to get to 100 stacks if you just self-cast 3 tornadoes, and it cycles between all 3 element types, so you can proc each element type faster and easier. I would like to try and test if it's possible to make the spell only cast lightning tornadoes and see if it stacks Unbound faster with the Oath of Spring node, but for now it's working just fine. The other skill links I'm using are an Enduring Cry setup with urgent orders because endurance charges are invaluable at the moment for their defensive buffs. So just having 3 base endurance charges from it are good enough for our defense. I also have a setup with Frenzy plus Hex Touch plus Ellie Weakness to gain both Frenzy charges as well as applying the Curse, mostly for boss fights or other tough enemies. You could just self-cast the curse, which is a lot easier than landing the small projectile, especially without having maximum accuracy, but I like having the frenzy charges when it does hit. I may put this on my boots at some point in the 4-link so I can run multi-proj of some sword or some kind of accuracy to make it easier to hit. Then I also run a Flame Dash, faster casting, and Arcane Surge setup for movement, as well as keeping the Arcane Surge buff going. That is pretty much the whole build here. Nothing fancy, just some low life, huge spell damage, spell crits on the tree, as well as taking as much reservation, efficiency, energy shield as we can, as well as power charges on the tree. So, where do I go from here with the build? Well, first thing I need to do is max all my gem levels, and then try to double corrupt my tornado gem to get 21-23, as the quality of the gem is also really useful for movement speed of the tornadoes, which helps them seek out and destroy enemies faster for clear. Secondly, I will try to get an Empower once I get my 6-link shafts finished. Thirdly, I know I can gain a lot more power if I find some good Circle of Ambition rings, as well as looking for that Timeless Jewel and a good Watcher's Eye. Now, there is one issue that I have, and I actually have this issue a lot with builds that I try and create, as I'm not really used to making my own builds. Usually they fall off super hard at red maps or into Shaper Guardians and normal bosses, and I never even get the pinnacle boss with my own builds. I have a really hard time scaling damage and defenses into late game, so I'd like to ask you guys in the community who may have a lot more experience than I do in Path of Exile for any suggestions on how to increase my damage and or defense from this point going forwards. We do have enough burst damage to melt red map bosses for farming, but I find myself dying a lot, which is probably just from not having enough energy shield. But if any of you play low life builds, maybe you can help me out. Join my Discord in the link in the description, or just let me know in the comments. Path of buildings are also linked in the description for both my build and Matho's original tornado build, in case you wanted to see what I was working off of for ideas. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more POV content. Also look out for some Monster Hunter content as well as some Monster Hunter Wilds React content coming to the channel as well. Alright, later.
D4 bad.